Who came before Adam? S. The question had haunted scholars, seekers, and storytellers for centuries. Who came before Adam, peace be upon him? Was humanity truly the first of its kind? Or had other creations walked the earth long before? Some claim the Jinn, ancient beings of smokeless fire, roamed the world for ages before humankind was ever shaped from clay. Others whispered about mysterious creations lost to history, forgotten by time and erased from memory. The question was not simple, for to answer it meant confronting the very foundations of belief. It was this question that guided Samar al-Hakim, a young historian with a love for manuscripts, into the dusty corners of the old madrasa library. She had always been fascinated by stories of origins. Her grandmother used to tell her tales of creation at bedtime, singing lullabies about the beginning of life, the heavens, and the descent of Adam. Samar grew up listening with awe, but as she studied history and philosophy, her curiosity only deepened. She wanted not only the tales, but also the evidence. She wanted to know what people of the past had recorded about the mysteries before Adam. One rainy morning, Samar found herself in a silent corridor of the madrasa. The air smelled of ink, paper, and the faint trace of incense. Her task that day was ordinary, cataloguing old books, but fate placed in her hands a forgotten manuscript. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages fragile, yet something about it felt alive. When she brushed the dust away, she noticed the first words written inside, "For those who ask what came before the clay." Her heart quickened. Clay was the sacred symbol of human origin, mentioned in holy texts again and again. To speak of something before clay hinted at an older story, perhaps even a forbidden one. Samar could not ignore it. She sat down at the wooden table, opened her notebook, and began to read. The manuscript was written in a blend of Arabic with strange, archaic phrases. It spoke of a time before the first man, describing a world filled not with silence but with attempts. According to the text, the Creator had allowed different beings to exist in cycles. Some were beings of light called Nuran, who glowed like stars but faded quickly. Others were made of mist called Sabi, who wandered like shadows until they dissolved. Some were rooted in the soil like reeds and were called Ramli. Each form lived only briefly, learning a single lesson before vanishing. The earth, it seemed, was a stage of trials before humanity arrived. Samar's fingers trembled as she copied the names into her notebook. She remembered childhood stories of spirits and beings older than men, but here they were described with detail, almost like an inventory. Each creation was recorded with its origin, its purpose, and its end. The manuscript read like the work of a careful observer, someone who wished to preserve knowledge of a forgotten time. As she turned the pages, she found references to the watchers of before. They were not angels nor men, but record-keepers of creation. Their duty was not to interfere, but to observe, to witness the rise and fall of forms, and to note the lessons learned. The text described them as patient and silent, standing at the edge of time, watching the unfolding of existence. Some passages suggested that they debated which forms were most fit to survive. Other passages hinted that they themselves longed for understanding, yet were bound by command not to act. Samar leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of the words. The rain outside grew heavier, striking the windows in a steady rhythm. The world of the manuscript felt so close, as if the beings described had once walked upon the same earth she now inhabited. Could it be true that others came before Adam? Were these records symbolic, or had someone truly witnessed the ages before mankind? Her eyes fell on a section stitched into the manuscript with darker ink. It told of a being called the Wanderer. Unlike the brief creations that appeared and disappeared, the Wanderer endured across cycles. It gathered memories of the vanished forms, carrying fragments of their lessons. Sometimes it mended what was broken, allowing the next creation to learn more fully. Other times it revealed flaws, ensuring that the form would not last. The manuscript portrayed the wanderer as both guide and judge, neither cruel nor merciful, only fulfilling its role. The description unsettled her. If such a being truly existed, did it still roam the hidden corners of the world? Was it still watching mankind, as it once watched the creatures of mist and light? She shivered and closed the book for a moment, pressing her hand against the worn leather cover. The caretaker of the madrasa appeared, dusting shelves with a cloth. He noticed the book before her and raised an eyebrow. "Many things sleep in these shelves," he said with a knowing smile. "Some are better left undisturbed," Samar asked softly. "Do you think this book should be left unread?" He shrugged. "Books are like mirrors. They do not harm, but they can show truths we are not ready to see." When he left, Samar returned to her reading. The manuscript continued with a diagram, concentric circles filled with tiny symbols. At the center was written Al-Ta'dil, the adjustment. The outer rings described qualities being tested: endurance, curiosity, restraint, mercy. It seemed the watchers were searching for a creation capable of balancing these traits. None of the earlier beings had succeeded. Some were strong but lacked mercy. Others were curious but lacked discipline. The cycles continued, until at last the text suggested the clay of humanity was prepared. Samar realized she was reading not just myth, but an ancient philosophy of creation. The manuscript treated existence like a process of learning, a series of experiments before the final form of man. It was not dismissive of the earlier beings. It honored them as necessary steps. Humanity was not the first, but it was chosen to remember, to carry responsibility. The words echoed in her heart. She thought of her grandmother, who always said that to be human was to carry trust, the trust of memory, reason, and care. Perhaps this manuscript, strange as it was, spoke the same truth in another way. Night began to fall. The library grew dim, and the sound of rain softened. Samar closed the manuscript carefully and placed it in her satchel. She knew she could not ignore what she had found. Whether allegory, philosophy, or hidden truth, the text asked a question that demanded to be explored. Who came before Adam, and what lessons did they leave behind? That night, as she sat in her small apartment with the manuscript before her, she made a silent promise. She would uncover its meaning step by step, no matter how difficult. And she would not let fear silence her. For the first time, she understood that the story of creation was not only about beginnings, but also about responsibilities. And as she fell asleep with the manuscript beside her, she knew her journey into the mysteries of pre-human creation had only just begun. The hidden manuscript. The next morning, Samar woke to the sound of birds outside her narrow apartment window. The rain had cleared, leaving the city bright and crisp. Sunlight fell across the manuscript on her table, as if it too had been waiting for dawn. She brewed strong coffee, sat with her notebook, and prepared to study the text with greater care. The excitement of discovery had kept her awake most of the night, but her mind now felt sharper, filled with questions that demanded answers. She opened the codex again. The first section had already described the cycles of creation, the beings of light, mist, and reed, and the watchers who observed their rise and fall. But Samar noticed details she had skimmed over before. Marginal notes, written in a smaller hand, appeared in the corners of several pages. Some were comments like "too much fire" or "return to the breath," as if someone had judged the earlier beings for their flaws. Others were stranger, such as "learned grasping, integrated." They gave the impression of an ongoing experiment, a process carefully monitored and adjusted. As a historian, Samar wanted evidence. Was this manuscript part of a known tradition? Or was it the work of a lone mystic, blending myth with speculation? She thought of contacting her mentor at the university, Professor Rashid, who specialized in ancient cosmologies, but hesitation kept her silent. If she revealed the manuscript too soon, it might be locked away or dismissed before she understood it herself. For now the book would remain her secret. The next passages deepened the mystery. They described how the earth itself reacted to these early creations. When the beings of mist wandered, rivers grew restless, and storms rose without warning. When the beings of reed rooted themselves in patches of soil, forests trembled, and rocks cracked as if rejecting their permanence. The text suggested that creation was not passive but responsive, shaping itself around the beings that lived upon it. The earth learned from each trial, adapting for the next. Samar paused. The idea fascinated her. She had studied environmental history, how human actions changed landscapes, how civilizations shaped and were shaped by nature. But here was an older vision, not humans alone, but even the earliest beings leaving impressions on the world. Creation was a dialogue, not a single act. Each trial had left its trace in the fabric of the earth. Then came a longer section about the wanderer. Unlike the fragile creations that dissolved quickly, the wanderer endured. It was described as a solitary figure, neither entirely of light nor of clay, but something in between. It remembered the lessons of the failed forms and carried them forward. It walked across cycles of time, its presence both feared and respected. Sometimes it was a companion, offering guidance to the watchers. At other times it was an intruder, questioning their decisions. The manuscript hinted that the wanderer might still roam unseen, bound to observe but not to interfere in the final project of humanity. Samar underlined the word bound in her notes. The manuscript described laws, rules that even the most ancient beings could not break. Creation, it seemed, was governed not by chaos, but by order. Each trial had a beginning, a purpose, and an end. Even the wanderer, eternal as it seemed, was tied to boundaries it could not cross. The thought troubled her. If such beings truly existed, were they still here, hidden from human eyes? Could they influence history in ways people mistook for chance? She shook her head, reminding herself that she was a historian, not a dreamer. Yet the words of the manuscript carried a weight she could not dismiss. Later that day, Samar carried the codex back to the university. She wanted access to better light, reference books, and perhaps the privacy of the special collections room. The library was quiet, its tall windows pouring sunlight across shelves of manuscripts. She chose a corner desk and spread out her materials. She began to compare the script of the codex with other samples from the collection. The handwriting seemed older than she first thought, perhaps from the 12th century, though parts of the ink looked even earlier, as if copied from an older source. This layering made sense. Many manuscripts were palimpsests of traditions, rewritten over centuries. As the afternoon passed, she noticed something she had missed. Several pages bore faint impressions beneath the text, as if earlier writing had been erased and overwritten. She tilted the manuscript toward the light and saw ghostly traces of symbols. Some looked like stars, others like geometric patterns. Could this be a hidden layer, perhaps an even older text beneath the visible one? Her pulse quickened. If so, the codex was not merely a manuscript, but a vessel carrying fragments from multiple ages. While she studied, a shadow fell across her desk. It was Professor Rashid himself. His beard was streaked with grey, his eyes sharp and kind. "You look as though you have found treasure," he said, peering at the book. Samar's instinct was to close the manuscript, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Just cataloguing," she replied. "An unusual piece from the madrasa collection." He nodded, unconvinced. "Unusual indeed. I have seen many such books. Some carry wisdom, others confusion. Be careful, Samar. Curiosity is good, but knowledge can weigh heavily." His words lingered even after he walked away. She wondered if he had guessed the nature of the manuscript. Perhaps he too had encountered fragments of such stories in his research. But Samar knew she could not share everything yet. The codex was hers to uncover, at least for now. That evening she returned home with more notes and questions. She read again by the light of her lamp, and the manuscript seemed to respond to her persistence. A new section described a council called the Council of Measures. The watchers gathered to debate which qualities were essential for the next creation. They tested strength, curiosity, mercy, and restraint. But none of the earlier beings had balanced all four. The beings of light were pure, but lacked endurance. The beings of mist were curious but easily lost. The beings of reed endured but lacked mercy. Each form failed in its own way. Then came the line that struck her. At last it was commanded that a form be shaped from clay to remember not only itself, but also the lessons of those who came before. Samar read it aloud, her voice trembling. Humanity was not the first, but the chosen vessel to carry memory, to preserve the trials of those who had failed. To be human was not only to live, but to inherit responsibility. Samar sat in silence, letting the weight of the words settle over her. She thought of her grandmother's saying that life was a trust from God to humanity. Perhaps this manuscript was simply another expression of the same truth, written in ancient metaphors. Or perhaps it revealed more than anyone dared to admit. She closed the book and stared at the window where the city lights shimmered. The question pressed on her heart with new urgency. Who truly came before Adam, and what lessons had they left for mankind? The echoes of the forgotten Samar spent the following days in quiet isolation, dividing her hours between her university duties and the manuscript that had taken hold of her thoughts. The codex seemed alive in her presence, revealing meaning at a pace that matched her patience. Each night she returned to her apartment with pages of notes, and each morning she awoke with fresh questions. The mystery of who came before Adam had become more than academic curiosity. It felt like a calling. On the third night, she made an unusual discovery. As she read a section about the dissolution of the beings of mist, she noticed faint lines between paragraphs, almost invisible. She adjusted her lamp and found that they were not mistakes, but hidden inscriptions written in smaller script. The words were harder to decipher, but after long effort she managed to translate a phrase: "The earth remembers what the beings forget." This sentence troubled her deeply. If the earth carried memory, then the traces of pre-human creation might still be present in the world around her. Mountains, rivers, and deserts could be archives of ancient forms. The manuscript seemed to suggest that nothing was ever truly lost. The vanished beings had left behind impressions in the soil, the wind, and the stones. Humanity, shaped from clay, was made not only of earth but also of those forgotten memories. To be human was to be a vessel of remembrance. The following day, Samar went to the university's geology department. She pretended she was preparing for a lecture and asked to see maps of ancient riverbeds and rock formations. As she studied the maps, she felt a strange connection between the manuscript's descriptions and the features of the earth. Certain valleys, carved by water long before human civilization, reminded her of the passages about the wanderings of the mist beings. Some mountains, sharp and scarred, seemed to echo the restless strength of the beings of reed. It was as though the codex had written not myths, but a hidden interpretation of natural history. That night she read further into the manuscript and reached one of its most disturbing sections. It described a great conflict between the Watchers and the Wanderer. The Watchers had grown weary of endless trials. They wanted to begin the creation of clay, to shape a form capable of balancing strength, curiosity, mercy, and restraint. But the Wanderer resisted. It warned that clay, though promising, would also carry danger. With memory came ambition. With reason came pride. Humanity might inherit not only the lessons of those before, but also their flaws. The manuscript recounted the debate as if it had been witnessed directly. The Watchers argued that creation must continue, that perfection required progress. The Wanderer replied that imperfection was inevitable, that clay would walk between light and shadow, carrying the potential for both greatness and destruction. In the end, the decision was made not by the Wanderer, but by command from above. A command that the clay must be shaped and given life. Samar could not look away from the final lines of that section. Thus, the trust was placed upon them, and the heavens and the earth declined to bear it. She recognized the echo of a verse she had memorized as a child, a verse from Holy Scripture about the trust given to mankind. The manuscript had woven ancient revelation with its own narrative, blurring the line between theology and forgotten memory. For the first time, Samar wondered whether the Codex was a hidden commentary, a mystical attempt to explain scripture through unseen stories. Days turned into weeks. Samar began to live in two worlds: the ordinary world of lectures, students and research papers, and the hidden world of the manuscript where pre-human beings struggled, learned, and vanished. She became cautious, carrying the Codex everywhere in her satchel and reading only when she was certain she was alone. She had not told Professor Rashid or anyone else about the full contents. A part of her feared ridicule, but a deeper part feared that if the truth spread too soon, the manuscript would disappear into a vault, sealed away forever. One evening she took the Codex to the rooftop of her building. The city lights stretched in every direction, while above her the sky glittered with stars. She opened the book and read aloud in a whisper. The words felt different under the open sky. When she reached the passage about the Council of Measures, a sudden wind rose, fluttering the pages. She held the manuscript tightly, heart racing. For a moment she thought she saw a figure at the edge of the rooftop, a shadow that shimmered and then vanished. She blinked, uncertain whether it was imagination or something more. The thought of the wanderer returned to her. Could it be that this being, described in the manuscript as eternal, still roamed the earth, observing silently? She shook her head, unwilling to let fear cloud her mind. But deep inside she felt watched. The manuscript was not only telling her of the past, it was drawing her into its story. The next morning Samar awoke with a decision. She would trace the origins of the Codex. She wanted to know who had written it, when, and why. She began by studying the paper and ink. The watermarks suggested it had been copied in the 12th century, likely in North Africa. But the language contained older elements, pointing back to at least the 9th century, perhaps even earlier. She searched through catalogues of manuscripts across libraries, looking for references to similar texts. After weeks of effort, she found a brief mention in an obscure index, a book of pre-creation, author unknown, banned in some circles for dangerous speculation. The entry was dated centuries ago, with no further explanation. Her curiosity grew sharper. Why had the text been banned? Who decided it was dangerous? She began to imagine the scholars of the past, some preserving the manuscript in secret, others condemning it as heresy. Perhaps that was why it had been hidden in the madrasa alcove, waiting for centuries until she discovered it. That night she returned to the Codex and continued reading. She reached a new section unlike any before. It described visions seen by the early creations, visions of a coming form, shaped from clay, carrying both light and shadow. The beings of mist saw it in dreams before they dissolved. The beings of reed felt its footsteps in the earth before they vanished. Even the beings of light glimpsed its outline before their glow faded. It was as though all the failed creations had foretold humanity, preparing the earth for its arrival. The manuscript ended that section with a haunting line: "What is remembered does not die, and what is forgotten does not rest." Samar whispered the words to herself. They seemed to echo in the quiet of her apartment, as though the walls carried the memory of the vanished beings. She felt both humbled and unsettled. Humanity was not the first, nor perhaps the last. It was part of a larger story that stretched beyond comprehension. Samar closed the book and pressed her hands against its cover. She realized that her journey had only begun. The question of who came before Adam was not simply about history or theology. It was about identity. If humanity carried within itself the memory of forgotten creations, then every person was more than they appeared. Each human life was a continuation of trials that began long before the first breath of clay. And perhaps, she thought with a chill, the wanderer still walked among them, watching to see whether mankind would succeed where others had failed. The final trust summer's nights had grown longer, her days quieter. The manuscript had become her constant companion, filling her thoughts with questions she had never dared to ask before. Each passage she uncovered brought her closer to an answer, but also deeper into mystery. She had begun to sense that the Codex was not only a record of the past, but also a warning for the present. Humanity, it suggested, carried within itself the burden of all that came before. To fail was not only to fail as individuals, but to break the chain of lessons inherited from forgotten creations. One evening she found a passage she had not noticed before. It was written in a slightly different hand, as though added later by another scribe. The words were clear and heavy. The clay was chosen, not because it was the strongest, but because it could remember. To remember is to bear the weight of what others could not carry. Samar read the line again and again. Memory was not just a gift, it was a responsibility. The earlier beings had vanished because they lacked balance, but humanity had been entrusted with remembrance, with the ability to learn from both the past and the unseen. That was the true meaning of the trust given to Adam and his descendants. Her heart grew restless. She longed to understand more, but she also feared what she might uncover. As if answering her hesitation, the manuscript shifted into a narrative voice unlike anything before. It told of the moment when the clay was finally shaped, when the form of man stood lifeless before the command of breath. The watchers gathered in silence. The wanderer, unwilling but obedient, bowed its head. And then came the command, be. The breath entered, and humanity began. The Codex described how the heavens trembled at that moment, how the earth itself quivered with recognition. It was not only the birth of Adam, but also the culmination of all that had been tried before. The memories of light, mist, and reed were woven into the clay. Humanity was not merely new, but also ancient, carrying in its veins the lessons of forgotten ages. Samar closed her eyes and let the words sink into her heart. She thought of her grandmother's voice, of the lullabies that spoke of trust and responsibility. The manuscript did not contradict her faith, but deepened it. It gave shape to what Scripture had already hinted, that humanity's role was not casual, that mankind carried a trust so heavy that even the heavens and earth had declined to bear it. As the days passed, Samar began to notice something strange. She felt watched, not with malice, but with quiet patience. Sometimes, when she walked home from the university, she sensed a presence at the edge of her vision. Once, while reading on her rooftop, she thought she saw a shadow leaning against the sky, silent and still. She could not explain it, but she knew what the manuscript would have called it, the Wanderer. At first the thought frightened her, but then she understood. The Wanderer was not her enemy. It had watched countless forms rise and fall, and now it watched humanity. Perhaps it was not there to harm, but to witness, to see if mankind could succeed where others had failed. She whispered into the night air, unsure if anyone listened, "We will try. We will not forget." Her final reading of the manuscript came one quiet morning when the city was still asleep. She opened to the last stitched page, a page so thin it almost tore between her fingers. The words were faint, yet she could read them clearly. When the clay remembers, it is alive. When it forgets, it returns to dust. The trust is not knowledge alone, but mercy. For without mercy, the lessons of the past turn to ashes. Samar placed her hand gently on the page. Tears filled her eyes. The Codex was not only about who came before Adam, but about what it meant to come after. Humanity was the bridge between what had been and what could be, chosen not because of strength or perfection, but because of the ability to carry memory with compassion. She closed the manuscript for the last time. She no longer needed to chase every detail or prove every theory. The message was clear. The beings before Adam had not been failures, but teachers. Their lessons lived on in humanity's nature, waiting to be remembered. To live as a human was to honor those forgotten forms, to walk carefully, to seek balance, and above all, to show mercy. Samar returned the Codex to the library alcove where she had found it. She knew others might discover it one day, just as she had. But she also knew that its true message could not be locked away. It was already alive in her, carried in her memory, ready to be shared through her words and her actions. That night, as she walked beneath the stars, she felt no fear of the unseen. If the wanderer was there, it walked beside her not as a shadow, but as a reminder. The trust was now hers, as it was for all of humanity. And she would carry it, just as those before had carried their lessons, until the day came when clay returned to its creator.